My name is Valerie Miller and I'm 27 years old. 10 days after my father, Gerald Miller, passed away, my mother and brother finished stripping me of everything from the family mansion and bank accounts to my father's very dignity. They cast me out to a decaying house in the Savannah marshlands like a piece of cheap charity. I thought I had lost it all until my phone vibrated in the dead of night. It was Gary Winston, the only contractor my father trusted before he died. His voice was trembling, filled with a chilling dread. "Valerie, you need to get here right now. I just pulled back the oak bookshelf in your father's old study and discovered a strange double wall. There's something bolted deep inside the brickwork, and your father strictly instructed me to show it to you, only if something happened to him." As I raced there through the pouring rain, standing before the dark hollow that had just been pried open, a cold gust from the past struck me right in the chest. My instinct told me that what lay silently behind that layer of mortar wasn't just my father's legacy, it was a bone-chilling truth, capable of incinerating the entire empire of lies my mother and brother had so meticulously built. Before I reveal the terrifying secret hidden within that wall, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications if you also believe that the truth always finds a way out. Your support is the fuel that keeps these stories of justice spreading. Now brace yourself, because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how you think about family greed. The oppressive humidity of Savannah seemed to thicken inside the mahogany-paneled office of our family attorney just 3 days after we laid my father to rest. I sat on a stiff leather chair, still dressed in my black funeral attire, feeling the suffocating weight of the silence. Across from me, Martha Miller, my mother, was a statue of icy perfection, her pearls gleaming under the dim chandelier light. Next to her sat my brother Derek Miller, who was leaning forward with an expression of feigned concern that didn't reach his predatory eyes. The air was heavy with the cloying scent of Martha's expensive French perfume, a smell that had always signaled a looming disaster in our household. "Valerie, we need to address the unfortunate reality of your father's estate." Derek began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, as he slid a thick manila folder across the polished desk. I opened it and my heart dropped into my stomach. It was a mountain of fabricated debt spreadsheets and forged signatures, claiming I had siphoned over $300,000 from the family's architectural firm for my personal expenses. My hands began to shake as I looked at the blatant lies printed in black and white. "What is this? I never took a single penny from Dad," I whispered, my voice cracking with disbelief. Martha didn't even blink. She simply adjusted her lace veil and looked at me as if I were a stain on the family's prestigious reputation. The family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, who had served my father for decades, remained chillingly silent. He didn't look at me once, his gaze fixed on a spot on the wall as he cleared his throat. "The records speak for themselves, Valerie," he murmured, his neutrality clearly bought and paid for by Derek. I realized then that I was stepping into a trap meticulously laid long before the funeral flowers had even begun to wilt. My brother's smile widened, revealing the shark-like greed beneath his expensive suit. "We can settle this quietly, sis." Derek continued, tapping the folder with a gold-plated pen. "Sign this document to waive your rights to the main estate and the trust fund to repay what you borrowed. In exchange, Mother is gracious enough to let you have the old property out by the marshlands. It's a fresh start, far away from the city." The ultimatum was clear: accept the ruins of a shack and disappear, or face a public lawsuit for fraud that I had no money to fight. I looked at Martha Miller, hoping for a shred of maternal protection, but her eyes were like granite. "It is for the best, Valerie. You've always been difficult," she said, her voice dripping with cold disappointment. With a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, I gripped the pen and scrawled my name on the lines they pointed to. Each stroke felt like I was signing away my soul, officially severing my ties to the world of wealth and status I had grown up in. As I stood to leave, Derek's smug laugh echoed behind me, marking my official exile from the Miller legacy. The Isle of Hope lived up to its name in the most ironical way possible, as I dragged my meager belongings into the skeletal remains of the marsh house. The humidity here felt different, thick, salty, and heavy with the scent of decaying vegetation. My footsteps echoed hollowly against the warped pine floorboards, a stark contrast to the plush, sound-absorbing carpets of the Miller mansion. As I began to clear away the thick layers of dust in the small room that had once served as my father's secondary study, a series of deep, jagged gouges in the wood caught my eye. These weren't random scratches from moving furniture. They were deliberate, repetitive marks situated precisely where the massive oak bookshelf stood. It looked as though the heavy cabinet had been dragged back and forth with desperate urgency many times. A soft knock at the open door startled me, and I turned to find an elderly man standing there clutching a worn leather portfolio. "My name is Douglas Vance Valerie. I was your father's lead architect, and more importantly, his closest friend." He introduced himself, his voice raspy but filled with a warmth I hadn't felt since the funeral. He stepped inside, his eyes lingering on the scars on the floor. Douglas explained that during the final months of his life, Gerald Miller had become increasingly paranoid about the safety of his digital records. "Your father suspected that Derek was systematically draining the company's offshore accounts. He hired me to secretly install a reinforced double wall behind that bookshelf because he no longer felt safe in his own home." Douglas whispered, his hand trembling slightly as he gestured toward the wall Gary Winston had mentioned. The peaceful moment was shattered by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine outside. A silver sports car screeched to a halt in the overgrown driveway, and Derek Miller stepped out looking completely out of place in his tailored suit amidst the tall marsh grass. He didn't bother to knock, storming into the house with a sneer of disgust. "This place is a biohazard, Valerie. You're embarrassing the family name by staying in this dump." My brother barked, his eyes darting nervously toward the study. He pulled out a checkbook and scribbled a figure that wouldn't even buy a mid-range sedan. $10,000. Sign the deed over to me now, and I'll have a demolition crew here by morning to level this eyesore. It's for your own safety." I stood my ground, clutching the dusty curtain fabric for support. "Why the sudden interest in a dump, Derek? If it's so worthless, why are you here?" I countered, my voice steadying. His face contorted into a mask of pure rage, the mask of the doting brother slipping away completely. "Don't play games with me. You're living on borrowed time," he threatened, stepping uncomfortably close. "I have enough influence in this county to have your power cut and your water lines capped by sunset. You'll be sitting in the dark, surrounded by alligators and mud, with nothing but your pride. This house is going to be flattened one way or another." He threw the check onto the scarred floor and stormed out, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and a lingering sense of imminent danger. The sweltering morning of the 10th day arrived with a stillness that felt like a held breath. Gary Winston stood beside me in the cramped study, his face set in grim determination as he hoisted a heavy sledgehammer. With a rhythmic, deafening roar, the first blow struck the false wall behind the empty bookshelf, sending a cloud of chalky white dust into the stagnant air. Every subsequent strike echoed through the hollow house like a heartbeat, shattering the dry plaster and brickwork that had kept my father's secrets safe from his own family. As the final layer gave way, Gary reached into the dark, jagged cavity and carefully extracted a small, reinforced steel box, coated in a thick layer of grime, but still remarkably intact. There was no glimmer of gold or stacks of cash inside. Instead, its weight was purely emotional, containing the only things Gerald Miller deemed valuable enough to hide. With trembling fingers, I pried open the lid to find a notarized envelope and a weathered silver USB drive lying on a bed of velvet. I immediately recognized the official seal on the document. It was the original, unadulterated last will and testament dated just weeks before his sudden passing. My eyes blurred with tears as I realized he had left the entirety of the Miller estate and the architectural firm to me, trusting only his artist daughter to preserve his legacy. Gary silently handed me his rugged laptop, and as I inserted the drive, the silence of the room was broken by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the voice of my father, weak and labored, yet carrying an unmistakable sharpness that commanded attention even from beyond the grave. The audio file was a hidden recording of a confrontation in his bedroom on the night of his first major heart attack. I heard Derek Miller's voice, harsh and frantic, shouting over my father's gasps for air. "Just sign the transfer papers, Dad. No one will ever know about the fabricated debts." My brother snarled, the sound of rustling paper punctuating his demands. My father's labored breath hitched as he replied with a haunting clarity, "You've stolen from the company, Derek. You've betrayed everything I built." The recording didn't end there. It captured a moment of chilling realization that shattered my remaining hope. My father began to address me directly, his voice softening into a tragic whisper. "Valerie, if you are hearing this, know that Martha Miller is aware of every move her son has made. She chose to protect the family name and her social standing over my life. They are leaving me to die in this room while they divide the spoils." The revelation of my mother's complicity hit me harder than the hammer had hit the wall. It wasn't just Derek's greed. It was a coordinated betrayal by the two people who were supposed to be my protectors. I sat on the dusty floor clutching the USB as if it were a lifeline while the weight of the truth settled over me like a shroud. The evidence was now in my hands, a digital confession of elder abuse, financial fraud, and a mother's cold-blooded silence. My brother thought he had buried his crimes under the floorboards of a rotting house, but he had underestimated the foresight of a man who knew his time was running out. Gary looked at me, his eyes mirroring my own resolve, as the recording faded into the sound of a distant, lonely wind. The Miller estate was ablaze with light, its grand windows reflecting against the manicured lawns of Savannah, as if the tragedy of 10 days ago had never occurred. Inside, the elite of the city gathered to celebrate Derek Miller's official appointment as chairman, their laughter clinking alongside expensive crystal flutes. I stepped into the foyer, my muddy boots and damp clothing a stark contrast to the sea of silk and tuxedos. I didn't scream, and I didn't shed a single tear. Instead, I moved with a chilling surgical precision toward the central sound system near the grand staircase. The crowd began to murmur, their curiosity turning into judgmental whispers, but I kept my gaze fixed forward until I reached the digital console. With a steady hand, I plugged in the silver USB drive I had recovered from the Marsh house. The upbeat jazz music died, instantly replaced by a haunting, static-filled silence that commanded every ear in the room. Then my father's labored gasps for air began to amplify through the high-end speakers, chilling the champagne in the guests' hands. I watched Derek Miller freeze mid-conversation, his face draining of color, as his own recorded voice boomed through the hall. "Just sign the transfer papers, Dad. No one will ever know about the fabricated debts." The room became a vacuum of sound, every socialite and business partner staring in horror at the man they had come to honor. I turned the volume higher as the recording captured Derek's snarl and my father's desperate struggle. It was only 30 seconds of audio, but it was enough to strip away the carefully crafted veneer of the Miller legacy in front of the people who mattered most. I stepped onto the polished marble floor and walked directly toward the head table where Martha Miller sat. She remained perfectly upright, though her knuckles were white as she gripped the silk tablecloth. Without a word, I reached into my coat and pulled out the thick folder containing the evidence of Derek's systematic embezzlement and the shell companies he had used to hollow out the firm. I threw the papers onto the table, the documents scattering across her silver dinnerware. I didn't give her the original will or the master drive. I gave her a glimpse of the catastrophe she had helped create. I wanted her to see the dirty fingerprints of her son's greed on the prestige she valued above all else. Martha finally stood, her face a mask of pale, aristocratic fury, as she struggled to regain control of the situation. "You are trespassing, Valerie. This is a private event, not a stage for your delusions," she hissed, her voice trembling despite her attempts at authority. She signaled the private security guard standing at the perimeter of the ballroom, her eyes darting toward the silent, judgmental faces of her guests. "Remove this woman immediately. She is mentally unstable and has resorted to illegal tampering to harass this family." She barked, her hand pointing toward the exit. As the guards closed in, I met her gaze with a calm, terrifying smile. I had been exiled from this house 10 days ago, but tonight it was their world that was truly falling apart. The cold, sterile halls of the Chatham County Courthouse felt like a labyrinth designed to swallow the truth whole. By the following morning, Douglas Vance and I stood before the district attorney's office, armed with the evidence that should have ended Gerald Miller's reign of deceit. However, the atmosphere in the room shifted the moment we stepped inside. The friendly nods usually reserved for the city's elite had turned into walls of bureaucratic indifference. We were ushered into a private hearing with a senior local judge, a man whose name had appeared frequently in my father's old ledgers as a regular golfing partner of the Miller family. As Douglas laid out the records of embezzlement and played the chilling audio recording, the judge's expression remained unreadable, his eyes as cold as the marble floors outside. Instead of issuing the immediate warrants we expected, he leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, weary sigh. "This is a serious accusation, Valerie, but the authenticity of digital evidence is notoriously difficult to verify in a local court," he stated, his voice dripping with an artificial concern. He claimed that because the USB was recovered by an unlicensed contractor in an unauthorized search, the court required an extensive independent forensic audit before any criminal proceedings could begin. He effectively issued a stay on the investigation, delaying the case indefinitely to protect the integrity of the judicial process. Douglas grabbed my arm as we walked out, his face pale with a mixture of fury and realization. "They've bought the county, Valerie. As long as we stay within Savannah's limits, Martha Miller and her son will always have a shield," he whispered, glancing nervously at the security cameras. I realized then that my mother's threat at the party wasn't just posturing, it was a statement of fact. The local police, the prosecutors, and even the judges were threads in a tapestry that she had woven over decades. If I stayed here, the evidence would be suppressed, and I would likely be the one facing charges for trespassing or harassment before the sun went down. Instead of returning to the decaying house at the marsh, I made a silent, desperate decision. We bypassed the Miller estate and drove straight to the interstate, leaving the moss-draped oaks of Savannah behind as the sky turned a bruised purple. Douglas drove through the night while I clutched the notarized will and the master drive in my lap, our destination being the FBI field office in Atlanta. By bringing this to federal authorities, we were stepping outside the reach of the Miller family's local influence. I was no longer just seeking a daughter's revenge. I was filing a formal complaint for interstate financial fraud and federal tax evasion. As the city lights of Atlanta finally appeared on the horizon, I knew that while justice had been delayed in my hometown, a much larger hammer was about to fall on the house of cards my brother had built. A week later, the heavy silence of the Miller estate was shattered not by the clinking of crystal glasses, but by the piercing wail of federal sirens. The moss-draped oaks seemed to shiver as a fleet of black SUVs swarmed the circular driveway. I stood across the street watching as agents in windbreakers marked FBI breached the grand entrance. Gerald Miller was led out in handcuffs, his expensive suit rumpled, and his face a mask of humiliated disbelief. He was being charged with interstate financial fraud and federal tax evasion crimes that Savannah's local influence could no longer mask. Behind him, Martha Miller appeared stripped of her aristocratic poise as an official read her the charges for complicity and the fraudulent manipulation of a legal will. Every asset tied to the family name was frozen, the grand mansion now nothing more than a crime scene under federal investigation. As the sun began to rise over the marshes, I realized that the truth is like a river. You can build dams to obstruct its path for a moment, but eventually the pressure becomes too great, and the water finds its way to the sea. My father, Gerald Miller, understood this better than anyone. He knew that family isn't merely defined by shared blood, but by the protection and respect we afford one another. In the end, he had protected me the only way he still could, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs through the very walls of the house he built. I had learned that when a local system becomes corrupted by greed, one must have the unwavering persistence to seek a higher light, for true justice knows no borders. I walked down to the weathered wooden pier at the edge of the Savannah River, watching the distant white sails catch the morning breeze. The Miller legacy as the world knew it had collapsed into a heap of legal filings and shattered reputations. I had lost the family I thought I knew, but in the ruins I had found a strength I never knew I possessed. The ghost of the girl who was bullied into a marsh house was gone, replaced by a woman who had reclaimed her father's honor. As the golden light danced across the water, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over my soul. The silent walls had finally spoken, and for the first time in 10 days, both my father and I were truly free.